Good morning, everyone. My name is Alice Hernandez. I'm a senior program administrator at the University Online Education Services at Rutgers University. On behalf of the 2025 Rutgers University Online Learning Conference, I welcome Cynthia Simon, lecturer from the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, as well as the Political Science Department at the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers, New Brunswick. We are delighted to have her share her insights on fostering an inclusive classroom environment and ensuring accessibility for students facing economic challenges, work commitments, and disabilities. During the presentation, please engage using the live chat session. You may post any questions you have, and the presenter will answer as we go along and as time permits. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking an interest in what I'm sharing today. My presentation is based off of a combination of trainings that I have taken in this area, as well as interactions with my students and myself being an individual with a disability and actually having gone back to school later in my life, being an individual who is also working and has family and stuff. So our session objectives are to learn strategies and practices to create an accessible and welcoming environment for students with limited economic resources, to learn practices and strategies to create an accessible and welcoming environment for working students or those with care responsibilities. So that can be parents caring for children, that can be students caring for either parents or grandparents or siblings, as well as to learn strategies and practices to create an accessible and welcoming environment for students with disabilities. So one of the biggest challenges for creating such an environment is being aware of what the barriers are in the first place that may impact students in these groups. And in my experience as a professor, and I will own that when I started teaching at the ripe old age of 26, I was terribly guilty of this. I was oblivious to a lot of the challenges that students faced. I had the privilege of doing my undergraduate education, mostly without having to work in order to survive. I wasn't taking care of anybody. I wasn't. I am a student with a disability. I've always been a student with a disability, but my undergraduate experience was relatively positive in that regard. But as the years have gone on, I have realized that students face many challenges and many more than they did when I first started college, because college now is much more expensive. You have a lot more people who are out working while they're trying to be students. So the first step to being able to address barriers is being aware of the barriers. So I'm going to ask if everybody here can kind of think about in the chat, what are some of the barriers that students with limited economic resources, work or care responsibilities, and disabilities may face assessing their classroom and their course material? Yes, textbooks are ridiculously expensive. We got one. How about other folks? Reliability, laptop or some other kind of device for light access. Good. Stable internet. Yeah. Software, especially if that's needed for a particular. I have a really old phone. I went on the other day to go to a meeting and found out my phone will no longer support Zoom Workplace. So that was thrilling. Other folks? No? All right. Transportation, that's a huge one. Transportation can be a real issue, particularly if you are, somebody who is, either can't afford a car, doesn't drive for disability reasons, those kinds of things. Inaccessible course content, yes. Juggling full-time work and school, absolutely. We've got quite a few students I've had with that challenge. Give you a minute or two. Come on, be brave, folks. Food, yes, that's one a lot of times we don't think about, but food insecurity can impact someone's ability to concentrate and do their work. And a lot of times students don't want to express that. They don't want people to know. unexpected changes in family responsibility, housing insecurity. I've had students who've experienced all of these things in my 29 years of teaching. Young children. Yeah. So I've divided this into categories of barriers, and we're going to take a look at what those barriers are, and then we're going to break out into breakout rooms to try to figure out ways to, as I say, work the problem. How can we address these things? So affordable course materials is a big one, right? Whether that's the textbook, whether that's if you're in a lab, the lab materials. It's being able to afford what you need to be able to be successful. Access issues related to disability. This can run a gauntlet to somebody's got lectures that aren't closed captioned. This can be, textbooks that are difficult to access through screen readers or are difficult to, auditorily listen to. This can be testing material that's difficult to access. This can be simply a student who, listening to a lecture is challenging because they have focus issues, or they could be English language learners, which is not an example of a disability, but this is another group of people that would benefit from a lot of the solutions to the access issues that relate to disabilities. So these are some of those kinds of access related to disability issues. You have professors who, you have someone who's hired as a note taker, but they're not a very good note taker because it depends how the schools find note takers. I once had one of the schools I worked at, it was not Rutgers, say to me, "Professor, who's a good note taker in your class? We need someone to take notes for one of your students." And I was kind of like, I have no idea. I don't know who's a good note taker. I don't sit there and watch them take notes. First of all, I'm legally blind. I can't really see who's taking notes. Fortunately, I had all my lectures online, which is what I told the person who asked me. I said, I don't know who the good note takers are, but all my lectures are posted on Blackboard. So, please direct the student there. They're there for everybody. Access to something other than mobile devices, and in some cases, mobile devices. This was somebody had written access to a reliable laptop. I've had students, I teach a lot of online classes. Their computer breaks. Their kid spills coffee on it. They don't have a plan B. In some instances, there really is no opportunity for a plan B because they're out in the middle of rural nowhere. But other times it's that they don't think to go to the public library, or going to the public library is a challenge because they have young children or they have transportation challenges. So it's working with students to try to figure out what that plan B is before they need it. Because a lot of times they just won't reach out. They'll just kind of quietly fade into the night. And unless you reach out to them, you won't know what's going on. Internet access was mentioned already, guys. That was, that can definitely be an issue. And again, depending on where you are, you may not be easily able to run on the campus and get internet access. You may not necessarily be able to go over to your friend's house because they have Fios and you have Optimum or whatever. Again, if you're out in an area where there's really only one carrier, that can create challenges. Barrier 2, workload timing expectations. This is a really big one. And again, college is set up for that person who's focused on being a full-time student. It's not set up for the folks who are not. Providing short notice for time-consuming assignments, limiting students' ability to work them in around their work schedule. I was recently aware of a situation where a professor assigned what was essentially the final exam, but it was a take-home project. Students had a week. It was 20, 25 pages for them to do in a week. So you're talking about hours upon hours upon hours of work that the student had. Not only did they not know what this was going to be, they didn't know that they had to budget that amount of time into that week. It wasn't, hey, by the way, you're going to have this assignment at the end. It's going to take you probably 15, 20 hours to do, or whatever the estimate might have been. So this is, this kind of, it's one thing to have a term paper where, from the beginning of the semester and you can work on it in bits and pieces. So it's just kind of last minute things, last minute changes in when assignments are due or classes are taking place. And sometimes you can't avoid that, but those kinds of things. Failing to consider that assignments may take students longer because they are not as efficient at research as faculty. Also because of disability and stuff like that. I was speaking with a colleague recently who was, saying how quickly they were able to, update their syllabi and update their course materials, in terms of researching for new articles and stuff like that. And I remember thinking to myself how many times I had students saying to me, this is taking so long to do the searches, to find the articles that are relevant to the research paper that they were writing. And for me, to find those articles would have taken a much shorter period of time, and I work more slowly. Yet the reason is they don't know how to ask the search questions. They don't have the background knowledge in the subject that we as professors have in what we're teaching. So it's helping students, become more efficient searchers so that they don't, have to spend hours upon hours upon hours that we wouldn't have been spending as faculty. Not taking into consideration that typing is no longer taught, especially for timed online tests. I learned this one from my students. I asked in a class I had one semester where a whole bunch of students didn't finish an online essay that was timed. And I asked the students, share with me, this was an online class, so I did it in a discussion board. I said, share with me the process you used to approach taking this test. And what I discovered was that quite a few of them just, they couldn't type fast enough. When I was in school, we were taught to type. And then they stopped because everyone used computers and everyone knew how to type on a keyboard. Well, now everybody's typing with their thumbs. So this is something to consider. Labor or time-intensive assignments that could be less labor-intensive and still achieve the same learning objectives. So I'll give you an example here. An assignment where you're requiring students to demonstrate some kind of research skills. And they need to use that research in order to answer. So ethics question, right? I want you to research the literature surrounding this ethical issue, use it in your consideration of whatever solution you're going to pose to the ethical dilemma. Well, there's two ways to do that. One is to have each individual student research, come up with their 3, 4, 5 articles that they might use. The other is to say, okay, class, everybody submit one article you found, annotated bibliography style, and then students can look at what everybody submitted. Hey, that article looks interesting, read it. That article doesn't look interesting, don't read it. It saves a tremendous amount of research time. They're still getting the research experience. They're still integrating and doing all the critical thinking. So that's an example of a labor-intensive assignment didn't need to take as much time as it necessarily did. Not providing at least 1 week and day to get work done in asynchronous online classes. A lot of our students work during the week. So if you're doing discussion questions, on a weekly basis, at least allowing that one day for that, that initial post. A lot of mine are due on Saturday or Sunday, so that students have that weekend day to actually be able to read the material and do whatever it is they're supposed to be doing before they enter the discussions. Barrier 3, group projects. I will admit my bias. I hate group projects. I will admit my bias. Mandatory group projects that do not take into consideration challenges students may face, coordinating schedules. Again, if you've got folks that are working, you've got folks with care responsibilities, if you've got folks in different time zones, depending on where you're teaching, I've had that as well, some of the places I've taught. This can create real, actual challenges in terms of people being able to get together either virtually or in person to do what needs to get done. Mandatory group projects in which accommodations for students with disabilities are not considered, right? So if you have a student who normally would have extra time, they work more slowly, that can be challenging. On the one hand, you might say, oh, let the other students pick up the slack, but that's not necessarily what should be going on, number one. Number two, you may have students that are hostile to the accommodations. I had that experience myself where a student gave me a hard time about the fact that I had accommodations that actually benefited everybody in the group because there were different dates on which the presentations were being done for the project. So we were given the last presentation date. And one of my group partners did not like that. So that needs to be considered. Inadequate clarification of expectations of how students should interact with each other in groups and how to address situations when issues arise. This is really important, right? If you have students, this could be working with individuals who are on the autism spectrum, right? So neurodiverse people interact differently than neurotypical people. This can be, and again, this isn't one of the categories in this presentation, but there can be cultural differences in the expectation of how people interact within groups. So when you don't give that information, you run into the likelihood or potential of more difficulty. You can have people that simply aren't familiar with expectations. They're just less experienced. This can create all sorts of challenges. What you want your students to do if they're facing these challenges, how can they approach you? Are you approachable? Will you assist them? Um, these are, again, people don't know what they don't know. So someone may not understand that you've got someone with a young child who's working a full-time job while being a student. And they, on the other hand, they're just in college and that's all they're doing. And they may not understand, that there should be an accommodation. There should be a way to figure this out. And then these experiences become very unpleasant. Barrier 4, overly restrictive late attendance policies, no late work accepted. And by the way, when you write that on a syllabus, people believe it. Even if what you really mean is no late work accepted, except in extenuating circumstances. If you come see me and we have a conversation, right? They believe no late work means no late work, and a lot of people won't approach in that case. Significant penalties for late work. Again, if you're going to accept late work, but you penalize it so much so that a person can't, pass the class or, can maybe get a C if they do everything really, really well. That's very discouraging. It's the kind of thing that makes people not want to try. It reduces retention. Significant penalties for coming to class late or missing class. Again, this is the scenario of transportation. You're relying on public transportation. It doesn't show up. You're relying on public transportation, and the only way to get there is 5 minutes late. There are those challenges. And barrier 5, course class scheduling. This is, as faculty, something we may not have control over. For those who are advisors, who are packaging students into their classes, anyone who's talking to students, acting as a mentor or advisor, this is a conversation to have with them. So packaging, I wrote freshmen here because it's usually the group that's done to, without considering work or public transportation schedules or care responsibilities. So I had a student, she would come to class, all of a sudden she stopped coming. And I reached out to her, it was an 8 a.m. class. And she said to me, I take 2 buses to get here. So I'm at the bus stop at 4:30 in the morning. And then I have to wait and transfer at the next bus stop. And I don't feel safe doing that in the dark as a young woman. So she stopped coming to class. Nobody asked her when they packaged her into that class whether she could get there. Nobody told her that she could say, I don't want to be in this class. I was packaged as a freshman undergrad at Rutgers, first semester into 5 classes. I looked at one of them and I went, there's no way. I'm not taking that class in freshman year or ever. It was honors calculus. I wanted nothing to do with it. And I just said, no, I'm not doing that. How's the add drop process work? But if you don't know that, then you're not going to do that. So these kinds of conversations need to be had with students. Even the first day, if you're teaching freshman classes in particular, of saying to students, here's some things to think about. You have the ability to change your schedule so that students know. I was fortunate. I had an older brother in college, so I knew that was a process. Scheduling an overwhelming majority of classes at times that work for traditional college students who do not work or who work very limited hours, right? This is just when our class is scheduled, what times do they start? Scheduling late afternoon and early evening classes, not quite late enough for working students to get there on time. That's someone's wandering in 10, 15 minutes late because of when they get out of what they're doing. So I've presented the challenge, the barriers. And my challenge for you guys now is to go into breakout rooms, and your breakout room number, it's 5 breakout rooms, matches your barrier. So barrier 1 is access to course materials. Barrier 2 is workload timing expectations. Barrier 3 is group projects. Barrier 4 is overly restrictive late attendance policies. And barrier 5 is course scheduling. I will say to my helper here, what's the most efficient way for folks to remember what they're, can they see the chat if they go into the breakout rooms to know what room numbers are?
They should be able to see the chat, but I'll also post it in the chat as well.
Okay. So I'm just going to look at the time to see where we are.
We're at 9:20 a.m.
Thank you. Because I want you guys to spend about really maybe 6-7 minutes kind of thinking about, I've given you many of the examples, but thinking about how do we solve those barriers? How do we help our students work the problems, or institutionally and structurally work those problems so that our students can be successful? And then we'll come back and someone from each group can share what they've come up with. And I'll also share some thoughts as well after people share theirs. And we hopefully can all learn from each other. Hello all and welcome back. So what I've done is I've put up the first slide for barrier 1, which is access to course materials. So that was breakout room 1. I would ask that somebody from that room, there should be a like a thing that says ask to join stage or something like that, that you can click on to ask to join stage to kind of report out from your room. If you would, someone would like to do that, that would be great. There we go. Hello, and is that Michelle?
Oh, yes, it is.
Welcome. What do you got?
Yeah.
What do you got to share?
All right. So some of the things we talked about in our group were having documents in multiple formats, making them screen reader friendly, making sure your materials in Canvas Shell are organized and easy to navigate. For resources, for internet access, we talked about making sure students are aware of what's available, such as labs and libraries. Also, letting them know about loaner laptop programs. And then for cost, we talked about open access materials and making sure to have textbooks on reserve at the library.
Those are all great ideas. Anyone from any other group want to add anything in the chat to maybe ideas for these barriers, this set of barriers, before I add some of my own thoughts? Yeah, a second or two. So 2 other things that I will mention that I have seen done are, one is incorporating the cost of the books within the program itself. So for example, there was a point at which there was a course I taught where anybody who took the course had access to the book through the course. So if you paid for the course, it was part of the fee, and you just it was it was an ebook. But this way, they didn't have to worry about going out and finding it. They didn't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. I say our friend Bill here wrote first day. I'm not sure what that's a reference to. So if he wants to elaborate, he can. But if I'm guessing, there is research that shows that students who have the book the first day of class are more likely to be retained and more likely to be successful. Okay, Bill's referring to a specific program, I guess, here at Rutgers. The other thing that, yep, there you go, and publish your course shells earlier so that students know what material it is that they need. This gives them a greater chance to go find it cheaper on Amazon or that kind of stuff. Include access to products for Barnes and Nobles. That's a good example. I will note one thing that I have found is the way financial aid works. Sometimes students are only able to get their books because of their financial aid through the bookstore, which of course means they're paying more. This is a problem. This is an area for advocacy work where, to kind of say to the people that are making these rules and regulations that if you want students to be able to afford their books, we have to do this a little differently maybe. But what happens is if students wait to get, the residual financial aid back, by the time they get it, you're well into the semester and they haven't gotten the book yet. Putting books on reserve at the library is another strategy. It's kind of old school, but that's a strategy for addressing that issue as well. I've suggested to students that, if they have friends in the class, they share the cost of a textbook and share the textbook as another means. Anybody else? Final thoughts on this one? The comment about knowing where libraries and stuff are, the only thing I'll add is that remember that sometimes our online students are not near the college campuses, depending where we're teaching. And they may, their access may be the public library. It may be Starbucks. I had a student one time who was military, and her husband was military, and they were being transferred from wherever they were to San Diego. And she was worried that she wasn't going to be able to get internet access because during that move, there would be this down period. So when she got to San Diego, and I reassured her, I said, it's San Diego. Just go to the local Starbucks, you'll be fine. Go to the local public library. There's free Wi-Fi all over San Diego. It's a big city. And she was, successful. She was like, yeah, you're right. There was Wi-Fi all over the place. Students don't always think about that. This student had actually reached out and asked me how to, work the problem. So those are all good suggestions. All right, let's go to our second group. While somebody is volunteering to speak for that group, let me put up the slide, barrier 2. All right, who's joining us from breakout room 2? Welcome.
Hi there. I was in breakout room 2. We were randomly chosen for this one, but we all had stuff to say quickly. We were talking about workload and timing expectations. One of our and mentioned or one of them was a professor. They were talking about boundaries, making sure that students aren't necessarily contacting people at 3:00 in the morning. Something that would allow, very clear expectations of when they can and cannot reach out. We were talking about weekend due dates are much easier for working students or those that don't necessarily have an opportunity to submit on a Wednesday because, they really do need the weekend to work on it because so many things are happening in their lives during the week. We were talking about time zone issues because a lot of our students, at least in our program, are from the West Coast. So perhaps if there is group projects, to consider putting them in different time zones or the appropriate time zone of what they're at. And, obviously the professor needs to be aware of those issues that are happening. So those were the 3 main points that we were able to talk about.
Other folks had thoughts in the chat on these categories? I will note as folks are typing that one of the important points here is students' expectations about how quickly they're going to get responses from faculty may differ from faculty expectations about how quickly we should be giving responses. So, that's really important that students know, hey, not only you're not going to get me at 3 a.m, but you're probably more likely to get me if you text me, if you're someone who allows students to do that, than if you send me an email. Like students who will message me in Canvas or Blackboard, depending on what school it's at. I'm not going to see those until I go in for that day. And I do go in every day, but I'm not going to see it instantaneously. You text me, I'm more likely to see it sooner. So letting students know how it's effective to get in touch with you, letting them know what your boundaries are is a really, really important one on that one. So they can also balance their workload and balance their timing. I've seen one of the schools I work at used to give estimates of how long different assignments would take. The students wouldn't necessarily know that. We got anybody else from this group? Nobody wants, there we go. I'm being told I can't be heard.
I can hear you.
Okay. So that is, those kinds of expectations. Let me just very quickly look back at what the other things that were on here. Obviously, we had talked about just helping students with search questions, directing students to the library to get help with search questions. Working with students on how to break down labor-intensive assignments is also important, because a lot of times students become overwhelmed by those assignments. So if you can break them down into their constituent parts, one of the things that I do, some of the classes I work have research papers, and they're broken down. There's a due date for submitting, something like an annotated bibliography or an outline, depending on what the class is. There's a due date for submitting drafts. There's a due date. And the purpose of that, besides giving the students feedback along the way, is so they're not waiting till the day before they're due to actually do the assignment. So some of that stuff can also help guide them and teach them time management, and direct them to take advantage of, courses or opportunities that the school offers, maybe through advisement or other places, to enhance time management skills and that kind of stuff. In terms of the weekday due dates, I'm going to make a comment about discussions. I think it's very important to be in the discussions with your students. So if you're going to have them actually due on, Sunday, then I think you need to be prepared to be in them on Sunday. One of the reasons I have the initial posts due on Sunday, not the replies due on Sunday, is sometimes I make it in there when they're there on Sunday, sometimes I don't. Whereas in the weekdays, then at least I can make it in. But they can do their initial post and their replies in my classes at the schools where I control the rules on the same day. There are some places that require them to go in on multiple days, and I do see students, not achieving that because they're doing all their work on the weekend. So they miss the frequency requirements. And I think that's important to be aware of that. All right, let's go on to the breakout room 3, folks. What did we come up with? My friends from breakout room 3.
Just a quick reminder, we are at 40 minutes, so we have exactly 10 minutes left.
All right, Allison, you are fuzzy. Are we not getting anyone from breakout room 3? That's what it looks like. No brave souls. Folks in chat, what do you think for breakout room 3? Anybody? Give them class time to work on it. That's an excellent suggestion. Other folks? Be flexible. Yeah. Also, I think giving people as early notice as they can about this. I let them pick one group member. All right. Picking groups. I will say one thing about allowing the students to pick group members. Just be aware that some students may end up left out in that framework. So you may end up having the weakest students or the students who are most challenged ending up working together, because they're the ones who don't know anybody, or they're the ones who have the most likely access issues because they're running around doing other things in life. Include training and asynchronous collaboration options. That's good. Outline who is responsible for what. Set clear expectations for what each group member is responsible. Choose tools that support accessibility. Grading also, since nobody said anything about this yet, is another one. There's all sorts of patterns people have come up with for grading groups. I saw one recently that I thought was very creative. It was half of the assignment was what you did, half the assignment was the group grade, and everything was online. It was all on, this was a Blackboard class, but it was all, everybody posted everything in the group discussion. So everybody could see what that interaction was, and the professor could see what that interaction was. So that kind of encourages people not to be slackers. It also allowed for people to work when they could work. And it allowed the professor to see what people were doing. So I thought that was very creative. If you structure a group assignment, that assignment had like 7 questions, so you could divide them up evenly among, well, try to come up with the number of questions that divides evenly. Let's say it was 8 divided by 4, 2 questions for each person. Other assignments don't necessarily divide up that easily, so you can end up with more issues, but those are all ways to do that, allowing people to meet virtually if they have to, allowing alternative submissions. I was aware of an assignment, they wanted students to create a video together. That created a problem because not everybody can meet synchronously to do that. So alternative ways to submit the work product could be helpful. And actually really ask, is it necessary that they work in groups? If somebody really has a challenge, maybe let them work alone. They may end up having to do more work than other people because they're doing it all by themselves, but that might be a more desirable choice for some people. So let's go to breakout room 4 and see what folks came up with from there. Any of my breakout room 4 folks want to join? No? Trying to keep track of time here. These ones are pretty straightforward. Balance the need to have work submitted in a timely fashion, both because we want to encourage responsibility and because some work scaffolds onto other work. So if you don't have this done, then you can't do the next thing kind of stuff. But also because we also don't want to be grading everything last minute because we actually have to meet our own grading deadlines. Anybody from breakout 4? Any comments from breakout 4? We discussed not even posting a late policy on the syllabus for that very reason. Flexible with deadlines, being responsible for career goals, allow a certain number of late submissions or allow a certain number of missed small assignments. Yeah, that's a good strategy also. I would say one thing about, you should post some kind of policy on the syllabus, only because if a student challenges what is expected, first of all, students need to know what's expected. But also, if someone challenges it, then you could point to here, this was what the policy was. I once had a professor, actually this was undergrad at Rutgers, who gave us a list of assignments, said how many points that each of them were worth, and said, as long as you do X number of assignments from each category, you can do as many of them as you want until you reach the grade you want to get. So needless to say, there was a chapter with abnormal psych. There was a chapter that had all the biology terms. I promptly ignored any assignment related to that because it's hard to memorize and spell biology terms. Sorry for the biology folks in the room. I verbally mentioned what students should do in my course welcome. Make sure that's in writing somewhere also, Jennifer, because people don't remember things and they're taking multiple courses. We're going to go to the next category, our breakout room 5 folks. Somebody I know posted earlier in the discussion in the chat about this one. They say they had to step out.
Yes, Mike wrote, we talked about approaches to the course catalog that are more descriptive and transparent about what is involved with the course, adding tags or other obvious indicators of modality, lab, writing intensive, experiential learning, research-based, etc.
That's actually an excellent example. And I know there's been some work, I think, at the state legislative level about, I think it has to do with the cost of courses, like letting students know that, hey, there's an additional lab course cost, or there's an additional, you don't have to pay to go on field trips or something like that. So again, it's that same concept and that same idea. I know we're getting up to near the end here. So I do want to go, I do have one more slide that deals with people being welcomed versus access. Access is I can get into the room. Welcomed is, do I feel like I actually want to be in the room? Ableism is a really big problem. It's not respecting accommodations. It's not respecting privacy when providing accommodations, right? So it's somebody, saying, John, you got to talk louder because Sue can't hear you, right? That kind of stuff. You're not supposed to call out Sue. That's actually illegal. not recognizing people with disabilities as a group that has been marginalized, right? So when you have conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, or even if you're not doing it directly, but you're talking about the experience of this group and the experience of that group, and always leaving out people with disabilities. I've had the experience where I've literally been told, you weren't selected because we wanted to increase diversity. And there's like no disabled people in the room other than me. Like that, it's that kind of conduct can be very unwelcoming. Failing to acknowledge responsibilities that working students and students with care responsibilities have. Again, this is this idea of, hey, this is when it's due. I don't care that you have, a child that was up sick last night, keeping you awake and keeping you from doing your assignment. Those kinds of things. Failing to recognize challenges related to having limited economic resources. It's just a failure to acknowledge the lived experiences of our students can create a very unwelcoming environment. It can also make it less likely that our students are willing to engage with us and let us know what their challenges are, and actually come to that kind of solutions where people feel welcome. I had a student one time who all of a sudden was showing up half an hour to class late, and I pulled her aside. I said, do I need to know what's going on? And she told me her mother's employer changed her mother's job hours, and now she had to bring the younger sibling to school. And I said, what are you doing at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the same day as our classmates? She goes, nothing. I says, good. Start coming to my other section of the course. Easy solution, but she would never have approached me unless I approached her. So concluding thoughts, and then you guys can do questions and answers. Access and inclusion barriers negatively impact student well-being, right? There is a well-being. There's a stress impact here. There's a health impact here when students, feel like they're unwelcomed and frustrated because they're having these challenges. Access and inclusion barriers negatively impact academic performance, right? If someone's reason they're not succeeding is because they needed that weekend day to get the homework done, and now they're being penalized for being late, that's not their ability to do the work. That's a timing issue. And access and inclusion barriers negatively impact retention, right? If our students aren't doing well academically, if their well-being is being impacted, if they're feeling frustrated by barriers, they're more likely to leave. So I thank everybody for coming and wanting to do better in this area. I thank everybody for sharing. I got a few new ideas here today, which I was glad for.